Zach Wilson is injured. How will the Jets manage until their signal caller returns? We will discuss on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, August 19th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Big shout out to subscribers to Locked On Jets, and to join that group, just hit the subscribe button wherever you are listening or watching. You will receive notifications as new episodes are posted, so you will never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Well, the Jets don't play until Monday. They have a Monday night preseason game against the Atlanta Falcons, which is probably good news for all the out-of-market fans who don't have to try and figure out how to stream the game, whether it's on NFL Network. The game's going to be on ESPN. And the Atlanta Falcons are in town a couple days early. The Jets are conducting some joint training camp practices with them. One of two teams the Jets will be conducting joint practices with during the preseason. They actually will practice with the Giants next week ahead of the preseason finale. But of course, the Jets are without Zach Wilson. The quarterback got injured in the preseason opener last week, 1 week ago tonight, against the Philadelphia Eagles. And on today's show, we're going to talk about how the Jets will manage without Zach Wilson, who they will turn to, what they can expect. Of course, though, the hope is that the Jets really won't miss Zach Wilson. Now, he's not going to play Monday. He's not going to play in the preseason finale against the Giants. But now with the new NFL format that began last year, there's only 3 preseason games, and you essentially have a bye week between your final preseason game and the regular season. Now, by all accounts, Zach Wilson's surgery, which took place earlier this week in California, was a success. The initial time frame we got over the weekend when the medical staff assessed Zach Wilson was that he was probably going to be out 2 to 4 weeks. Nothing changed after the surgery. Robert Saleh said before the surgery, you never know what you're going to find there. Well, they conducted the surgery. Zach Wilson seems fine. Or at least, well, obviously he went under the knife, so not completely fine, but there were no unexpected complications. So Zach Wilson's time frame is still 2 to 4 weeks, and if you line up the calendar, 4 weeks is just about the amount of time that gets us to week 1 when the Jets will play the Baltimore Ravens. And I think the hope is clearly that Zach Wilson will be ready for that week 1 game. Now listen, I've heard all the talk about, the Jets should not rush him back. Listen, do you think the Jets are going to rush Zach Wilson back? The Jets know how important Zach Wilson is to the franchise. If you and I know how important Zach Wilson is to the franchise, I think the Jets know how important Zach Wilson is to the franchise. And I think they are not going to put him in harm's way for 1 game. So, I think these concerns are kind of unfounded. And I hear people, now listen, I'm not a doctor, so take this with a grain of salt. But I hear people saying, well, they should sit him out an extra week. They should sit him out an extra 2 weeks just to be safe. And I hear people talking about like their own knee surgery. Like everybody's had a knee problem at some point in their life. You have to understand, just because your knee surgery took 6 weeks to recover from, it's a different injury. Not all every knee injury is different. Every injury is different. The expectations are different. The medical treatment you receive is different. You probably did not have an NFL team, medical staff working on your knee. On the other hand, you did not have to prepare for an NFL game. So these are all things that factor in, some of which probably benefit Zach Wilson, some of which do not. But at some point, the Jets are going to decide that there's not a substantially greater risk for Zach Wilson to be on the field. Now, from what I understand, there's never going to be no risk. If you want no risk, you just never play a player recovering from an injury like this. There's going to be some degree of risk. But the question is, and this is something the Jets medical staff has to figure out, and it'll probably be in consultation with the ownership, if it goes that high, definitely the front office, definitely the coaching staff. They'll figure out a point where they feel like Zach Wilson's healed enough, and he's not putting himself at substantially greater risk by taking the field. But if Zach Wilson's at a huge risk for a greater injury, they're not going to put him on the field. Please don't worry about that. Again, the risk is never going to be zero, but I just don't see the Jets putting their prized quarterback prospect on the field at a point where the risks are really great that he's going to suffer a more substantial injury. So all this talk, I mean, people say, well, they should sit him out an extra week or two to be safe. Well, if you don't really know what the injury is, how do you know that an extra week or two is going to make that much of a difference? If Zach Wilson's ready to play, I mean, my view in general, and again, I'm not a doctor, so I speak very broad terms on this, but once Zach Wilson's ready to play, he should be on the field. And of course, if the extra week or two makes a difference, if it does, then that's fine. But people are stating this as a fact, is that an extra week or two is going to make a difference. Now, if it is, of course, it very well may be. But I think any of us who first of all, don't have medical training, and second of all, don't have access to the information the Jets have, should go easy on our prognostications about when we think Zach will be back. Because we're not around the injury every day. We don't know what's going on with Zach. And at the end of the day, he's a football player. He's going to take the field. And you only get 17 games a year. And this is a big year for Zach. It's a big year for the Jets. Jets need to show some progress this year. So while, of course, you would never put the long-term health of your franchise, the health of your hopefully long-term quarterback into any jeopardy, once Zach Wilson's ready to go, I don't think that there's any reason to hold him back. So the hope is that he'll get back for this game. And if you read the tea leaves in the media, it does seem like there's a chance Joe Flacco starts this game against Baltimore, and we'll see what happens from that front. But I think it's pretty clear that the Jets, in an ideal world, and maybe in an ideal world, the start of the season would begin a week or two later, but in an ideal world, you'd like to have Zach Wilson back. So all of this is to say, this may all be a moot point. Now, will missing training camp in the preseason impact Zach Wilson? I mean, I think maybe to a certain extent. Obviously, you're working in a lot of new parts on offense, a number of new receivers. Last year, who are the key pieces who are back from last year? Well, Corey Davis is back, and Zach, I felt like for all of Corey Davis's struggles last year, Zach had a pretty good chemistry with Corey Davis. Now, Davis didn't make all the plays he could have made, but Zach put the ball in his hands an awful lot. You also have Elijah Moore. Now, that was a connection that was kind of lacking last year. They really never seemed like they were on the same page. So that could be an area where maybe, especially training camp practices, but also maybe a couple preseason games could help them develop. And then beyond that, you do have a lot of new pieces. Garrett Wilson's new to the team. The two tight ends, CJ Uzomah and Tyler Conklin, although by all accounts, Zach and Conklin seem like they're on the same page so far in training camp. And then, to a lesser extent, the running backs. Michael Carter was part of the team last year, but Breece Hall to the extent, and I don't know how much the Jets are going to split Breece Hall out wide. You don't really need chemistry for dump-offs or checkdowns or screens to a running back. So maybe to a certain extent, this stuff will impact Zach. And maybe you could see some rust in the early stages, but I don't know how much it's going to really matter for him. I mean, I think, he had the full offseason to prepare. All the talk was that he was working with these guys. He was working with his receivers throughout the offseason before the training camp began, after the offseason program. So, if we're talking about all the work that he did in the offseason working with these guys, I don't even know how much it really will impact Zach Wilson. And once he gets back, the games will have begun and he'll need to perform. But I think at the end of the day, while there is probably some impact from missing camp and preseason, I don't think it's going to be the defining factor in whether Zach Wilson succeeds or fails this year. I think it's going to be how much he's developed over the course of the offseason and how ready he is to go. And hopefully for the Jets, that will be by week 1. But of course, there's a possibility Zach may miss some time. It's not sounding like he's going to miss a lot of time, but how will the Jets get through it? It sounds like they're going to turn to Joe Flacco. So what could the Jets expect from Joe Flacco? I'll tell you what I think as we continue on this Friday episode of Locked On Jets. Of course, if you're a diehard Jets fan, it may not matter whether Zach Wilson plays against Baltimore week 1. You may just feel so confident in the team that you're going to put money down on the Jets. And you should know that BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. You can find reviews and news of every league. That includes Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, even combat sports, esports, golf, and yes, the NFL. The regular season begins in just a couple of weeks, and BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This show is free and available on all platforms. Today we're talking Zach Wilson's injury, how the Jets will respond. Now, we know Zach Wilson's not going to play again in the preseason, so the team still has 3 quarterbacks on the roster to take the snaps, and Zach was not going to take all the snaps anyway. He was probably going to have a limited pitch count, so it doesn't really impact. And we all know preseason results don't really mean a whole lot in the NFL. But the question is, what happens if we get to week 1 and Zach Wilson's not ready to go? And fortunately for the Jets, it doesn't sound like it's going to go far beyond week 1, even if Zach Wilson cannot go. And it sounds like all indications are Joe Flacco will start at quarterback for the Jets. Week 1 Baltimore if Zach Wilson cannot go. Is that the right move? I don't know. There is this segment of the Jets fan base that has taken a completely irrational position and they want Chris Trevler to start at quarterback if Zach Wilson can't go, based on what he did against the Eagles, because he let it come back in the fourth quarter against a bunch of backups. And I'm sorry, I try and consider every viewpoint. If you're calling for Chris Trevler to start based on that, you got to reassess what he did in that game, because Trevler had 6 completions. I watched every snap he took. I don't think he got to a second read once. And beyond that, 6 completions, 4 of them were literally dump-offs at the line of scrimmage to a tight end who was just dragging across the field horizontally. So it's not like he was making reads. It's not like he was tearing up the Eagles' defense. He showed some ability as a runner. But you're going to base six completions of preseason, 4 of which were just dump-offs at the line of scrimmage? That's the reason he should be starting? I'm sorry. That's too far for me to go. So the real question is Joe Flacco starting over Mike White the correct decision? I might lean toward Mike White. I talked about this all offseason. If you followed the show, you know I'm not a big Flacco guy at this point. I was a big Flacco guy 10 years ago. But at this point, I don't know, because we've seen Mike White execute a game plan under Mike LaFleur at a very high level. And we really have not seen I know the statistics against Miami last year in the game Flacco started looked good, but if you watch that game, Flacco did not play particularly well. Made some pretty big mistakes. Took a bad intentional grounding, a fumble in the red zone, and really the numbers were inflated by a play Elijah Moore made. It wasn't Flacco tearing up the Miami secondary the way the numbers may make it look. Whereas Mike White throwing for 405 against Cincinnati, that was a lot of Mike White playing really well. The one thing that gives me pause, though, and because Flacco was near the end of his career, the one thing that does give me pause about that assessment that Mike White should start is I've watched Mike White a bunch, and most of it's preseason, but you also include the Buffalo game. I can't really remember another time Mike White played well, aside from that Cincinnati game. And yes, the first quarter the next week against the Colts before he went out with an injury, but even against backups, and we saw that again against Philadelphia, Mike White was really struggling. You wonder whether that was just a one-game type anomaly. So Flacco does have the experience, which is part of my issue with the bringing in of Flacco to be the backup quarterback, because I feel like in the NFL, what teams do is they don't get guys who can run the offense effectively. They don't seek out the person who can most effectively run their offense. They seek a resume. It's almost like they're trying to sell you on the backup quarterback rather than finding the right guy, because they essentially give you a guy who you can point to like a bullet point or two on the resume. So Flacco is a good example. He won a Super Bowl 10 years ago. You have a Super Bowl winning quarterback as your backup. How can you dispute that this is a good move? Well, it's because where Flacco is at this point in his career. Now, the thing I'll say about Flacco is that this is not like it's Luke Falk starting for the Jets. If Luke Falk, you may remember him back in 2019, he was the 3rd quarterback after Trevor Siemian got hurt and Sam Darnold had mono. Started 2 games for the Jets, looked just awful. Just as hopeless as any quarterback could look. Joe Flacco will not do that. Joe Flacco's an experienced quarterback. And yes, people vastly overstate. This is another resume point with a with a backup quarterback, where people say, "Well, he's got all this experience." What does experience really give you? Well, in Flacco's case, I think it means that you can be sure that you're going to set the protection correctly. Guys are going to be in the right spot. He'll know where to go with the football. He knows how to read a defense. So these are positive things. And if you're asking me, is Joe Flacco somewhere between the 33rd and 64th best quarterback in the NFL right now? The answer would probably be yes. But I don't think he's at the high end of the backup list. I think at this point in his career, he is a pretty limited player. And a lot of that goes to the lack of mobility. Not that he was ever mobile, but the game has changed. And you need a quarterback who can extend plays, unless you have a guy who can read a defense like a Brady or somebody like that. I mean, Tom Brady doesn't need to be mobile just because he's so cerebral. He knows where to go with the ball in any situation. He can get the ball out quickly, but anybody else is going to need to have some degree of mobility, or they're going to be limited. And we saw that in the Miami game, where Flacco was constantly just taking the first guy that was open because he was under pressure and he could not evade the pass rush. So how can the Jets game plan for Flacco? Well, I think the big thing is they're going to lean into the run game if Flacco plays. And I think that was the plan with Zach Wilson, because the Jets don't want Zach Wilson to be sitting back in the pocket 50 times a game this year. That's not a good way to develop a second-year quarterback. So in some ways, this makes the Jets kind of not quarterback dependent, not as quarterback dependent as they've been in the past, and not as quarterback as dependent as many other teams are. They're going to lean on this run game with Breece Hall and with Michael Carter and this offensive line, even with Dwayne Brown in place of Mekhi Becton. And they'll try and win games that way. And that'll benefit Flacco, because if you don't have third and longs, it means the defense can't pin its ears back. It means that you'll see less exotic blitzes. You'll see less blitzes that give you a chance as a defense to get a free runner heading at your quarterback. These are good things for the Jets, and it means that some of those plays, if Flacco checks it down, will be more effective. I think the Jets have also given Flacco, and Zach Wilson for that matter, a decent receiving core. Now, Flacco is interesting. If you look through his recent years, there have been a lot of stretches where he's been kind of a check down artist. And I go back to what I was saying about how he can't evade pressure, so sometimes he just has to check the ball down. And then there are stretches where he's been very comfortable throwing the ball down the field. 2020 was with the Jets, after a year in Denver where he almost never threw deep. Flacco threw deep a lot in the games he started for Sam Darnold. It was like the one stretch where Brashad Perryman played well for the Jets. But I think it's tough, because to have a long developing play down the field, typically your quarterback needs to do something to extend it. It takes a while for guys to get down the field, and your offensive line usually can't block that long without your quarterback moving a little bit. So it makes it a little tricky. Flacco is never. The other thing that's true with Flacco is he's never really been a precision passer. He's never been one of those guys with pinpoint accuracy in the short game. He's more a guy who does enough, and generally knows how to avoid the big mistake. Things along those lines. So, can Flacco generate big plays in the passing game? Well, he did at certain points, but you're going to need some help there. And maybe that's where the two tight ends the Jets have come in, because maybe you need to leave an extra blocker in there to compensate for Flacco's inability to move. And maybe that means you get Elijah, maybe that gives Elijah more time to get down the field and you hit a big play with him there. But really, I don't think that the Jets are building this thing to force their quarterback to win the game. And that's the type of situation where I feel like maybe you have a shot with a Flacco. I don't think Joe Flacco can hold up for 17 games. Look, he hasn't led a team to the playoffs in 8 years. It was 2014. The good news is that he was running a similar offense to what the Jets are running now in 2014 under Gary Kubiak, who was a Mike Shanahan protege, and of course Mike LaFleur is a Kyle Shanahan protege. So Flacco is probably pretty comfortable in the system. His most recent good year came in this system. So I think he can get you through, but I do think he can get you through like one game. I think his veteran savvy, which is so frequently a cliche, it's the type of thing that can get you through one or two games. That said, if Flacco had to carry this team for longer, I think they'd be in trouble. So I think that's one of the big reasons. There are lots of reasons Zach Wilson's injury not being as serious are good for the Jets, and they're more about Zach Wilson. It's more about that you did not lose your second-year quarterback, who you're trying to develop, who you're trying to evaluate this year. That's a good thing, But beyond that, Flacco has shown. Listen, the last two times Flacco's been a starting quarterback at the beginning of the season, he's been benched. He's not going to get you through a full season. He might be able to get you through a game or two, and that's really what the Jets need. But as we close out this episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about how much staying power Flacco could have. That's as we continue here on this final episode of the week. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're talking about life without Zach Wilson for the Jets. Now, fortunately, it sounds like Zach Wilson's going to return to the lineup for the Jets sooner rather than later. But if he can't, Joe Flacco will be the starting quarterback. The Jets are certainly hoping Wilson will be back week 1 against Baltimore. But if not, Flacco will begin the season for the Jets against his former team. And there's interesting debates popped up this week. I've seen it all over the internet. I've seen it on podcasts. I've seen it on talk radio. I've seen it on various web sources. What if Joe Flacco wins games? Does he stay in the lineup? Well, to me, this is kind of a silly discussion from a couple standpoints. First of all, as I mentioned, I think Joe Flacco can get you through a game or two. I don't think Joe Flacco is going to get you through 17 games. But beyond that, I think it's one of those things where it could buy the Jets some time. Now, I mentioned early or in the show that we should be very hesitant to diagnose Zach Wilson without knowing any of the information. And I don't believe in the idea that you just throw out this blanket statement that he needs to sit an extra week to play it safe, because we don't know. Zach Wilson could be ready to go by week 1 or could be ready to go by week 2. But there also are scenarios where maybe the injury is a little bit longer lasting, maybe something's lingering there. And if Flacco plays well, it gives you kind of peace of mind, because it takes, to the extent there's a temptation, I still don't think the Jets would fall into this temptation, but it takes away the temptation that you're going to rush Zach Wilson into the lineup before he's ready. So that, I think that's a key point here for Flacco. And listen, if Flacco's winning games, I think what it does is it relieves that pressure. It means the Jets will bring Zach Wilson back more slowly. Listen, Joe Flacco, he wins 2 games. He's not going to be named the starter for the final 15 games of the season. Not like the Jets are going to make a change for the full season based on Flacco playing 2 games well. But what it gives you the opportunity to do is it gives you the opportunity to say, okay, well, if you're 50-50 on Zach, okay, well, maybe we'll give him another week because things are going pretty well. And it'll be like kind of like Mike White last year. Remember last year with Mike White when he played really well against the Bengals? And he looked pretty good in that first quarter against the Colts. Well, Zach wasn't ready to return the next week against Buffalo. So it gives you a chance to sit him out another week. And then once White falls back to earth, that's when Zach went in. Or I guess Flacco started the next game against Miami. But if Mike White kept playing well, they would have just kept going with things the way they were. And eventually Zach would get back into the lineup when White struggled. And I think the same thing will be true of Flacco. I mean, is Flacco going to lead the Jets to like a 5-0 record? I would guess not. Now, if Flacco leads the Jets to a 5-0 record, then we have a different discussion, and then maybe we change our expectations for the season. I mean, the Jets aren't going to change something that's working, but Flacco's job, and I think the reason the Jets got Flacco, and I would have liked to have seen them go in a different direction. I would have liked to have seen them going with a quarterback who maybe could give you a little bit more, but I think the entire concept of Flacco is that maybe he can get you through a game or two where you need it. He can be a bridge to Zach Wilson getting over a minor injury, and that's really what his job is here. And as long as he plays well, you'll probably bump Zach Wilson's return back another week, and you'll hear the Jets say, "Oh, we just want to be really careful. We don't want to take any chances." But it's one of those things that would be a luxury for the Jets, because if Flacco goes out and throws 2 interceptions week 1 and the Jets lose 24-10, then there's going to be a little bit more pressure. And I don't think the Jets would succumb to it if Zach Wilson really wasn't ready, but you like that pressure to be off the table. So that's where Flacco can really help the Jets out here, in addition to just the tangible aspects of playing effective quarterback and helping them win games. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. It helps us out tremendously. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk Jets Falcons.